Well, the Air Force sources have informed India today that they have presented hard evidence of the Balakot strikes to the government. India today, in fact, has accessed the first details of the Indian Air Force's Balakot dossier that has been prepared by the forces. The first official details that refute missiles missed narrative. This is what we're getting to hear from the top sources within the Air Force, that 12 pages of the high RES satellite imagery has already been submitted. So all this information that has been collated by the Indian Air Force and has now been presented to the government. I'm going to go straight across first to Abhishek Bhalla and our consulting editor Shiv Arur for more on this. Abhishek, so tell us a little bit more about all this information, all this, evidence that has been put together by the Indian Air Force and has been presented to the government.
Well, this is the assessment carried out by the Indian Air Force on the aerial strike. This is the usual protocol, and the Air Force has in fact informed the government about their assessment. They say that 80% of the bombs were in fact had hit the targets in Balakot. Also, they have imagery through the synthetic aperture radars in the aircraft that were part of the assault, and also satellite imagery. Although what we heard earlier was that the satellite images are not very clear because it was an extremely cloudy day. There was the weather was rough, and that's the reason why the images in the satellites are a little grainy. But as far as the synthetic aperture radars are concerned, they have captured clear images. They've also presented images before the attack and after the attack to show a comparison on what damage was done. Although, as Air Chief Marshal B.S. Dhanua had said, that there's no way of making an assessment on the number of terrorists killed, that doesn't find mention in this report.
All right, Shiv, the Indian Air Force has already established that the use of F-16s and AIM-RAMs were conclusively absorbed in these, in that aerial dogfight, in that confrontation between India and Pakistan. But give us more information about this information, this very detailed information that the Indian Air Force has put together and has presented to the government.
Avantika, this is not about the 27th of February. What we're talking about is about the airstrikes on Balakot, where we're talking about the actual strike operation that took place on the Jaish-e-Mohammed terror facility on Jabba Top. Now, we can confirm for the first time that the Indian Air Force has submitted two types of evidence to the government. This is not evidence because somebody is asking, because this is a matter of process. There is a 12-page photographic evidence in the form of high-resolution satellite imagery from an Indian satellite that has been submitted to the government, which shows the actual, the actual penetrations that the bombs have done on the roofs of those 4 or 5 structures. They've also submitted synthetic aperture radar imagery taken from an Indian intelligence aircraft that was flying in Indian airspace, which has a range of about 150 kilometers. Those radar images have also been printed out and submitted to the government. I know for a fact, and I can confirm to our viewers here, that this entire dossier of visual evidence, that is satellite imaging as well as synthetic aperture radar images confirming the strikes, have been submitted to the government. So it's up to the government now about whether it wants to actually release this this data. I also want to say that I have it on good authority from my sources in the Indian Air Force that of all the Spice 2000 missiles or bombs that were launched in this operation, 80% struck. Now 80% is a good number, but also remember that the other 20% could have been for redundancies. When you're trying to strike a particular target, you usually deploy more than one weapon, hoping that at least one of them would hit. So that would make up for the additional 20%. Most importantly, Avantika, what I'm getting from my sources is the reason why external evidence of damage is not very apparent is because these weapons that were used by the Air Force had penetration warheads, which basically means these don't simply explode when they hit the roof of these buildings. They are programmed to penetrate many meters inside, because apparently there was hard intelligence that there were multiple stories built into that facility precisely to keep people there safe. And so these weapons had penetration warheads, and they may have penetrated deeper into those 4 or 5 buildings and then exploded. The Air Force does not have battle damage in terms of the number of human casualties that have taken place, but given how these weapons have been programmed to penetrate and then explode, it's very likely that there were casualties. And a demonstration of this weapon in 2014 in Pokhran and the manner in which this weapon has worked against reinforced concrete structures in Pokhran with similar, small external damage, Avantika, has also been presented to the government.
So this is very important information, Shiv. It's coming at a very crucial time. The Indian, Air Force putting out all the evidence and these radar images that confirm that these were precision strikes and they were successful in hitting those targets. That's already been confirmed by the Indian Air Force Chief. All of this information being put together at a time when the opposition has been demanding for all the evidence and proof about those airstrikes.
The Air Force is, I think at one level, the Indian Air Force, being a highly professional service, was given a task to strike, these particular places. Their intention was never, or their objective was never to engage in any kind of a propaganda war, Avantika. So ultimately, if the intention was to be show demonstrable, strikes with buildings blasted completely and give two hoots about possible collateral damage, then perhaps the Air Force could have used high explosive warheads, etc.
Yes,
I'm not a military planner, but that would be my assessment or guess. But the purpose of using penetration warheads, which they've demonstrated in these attacks, and I am told that the satellite imagery has very clear evidence that the penetrations have happened on target. 80% of those weapons have hit their target and have been submitted to the government. That's point number one. Point number two, the Air Force has also submitted the use of similar weapons by the United States in places like Syria and Iraq, where the external damage is very limited and very, very similar. In those cases, the Air Force is of the view that nobody has ever questioned, why there's no damage, because there is a understanding that those are penetration warheads where they're supposed to blast through a reinforced surface and explode underneath. So the damage on the surface may not be apparent, but what's happening underneath will be very apparent in terms of actual casualties. The other very important thing, remember, because Avantika, at the beginning of this entire issue, Pakistan had shown pictures of broken trees and earth, and they tried to paint this picture that all these bombs had missed and fallen into open area. My sources in the Air Force say that 80% of the missiles bombs hit their targets, and it is possible that the blast wave of those explosives from below the earth may have disturbed the earth a little bit, because if such penetration bombs had fallen into open space, it wouldn't create that kind of landslide effect. It would have been a crater, because these bombs would have gone straight into the earth and exploded, and there would have been a mound of earth. So the physics of what has happened and what Pakistan has shown is not consistent with what actually happened. That's what the Air Force says.
Absolutely. And Abhishek, this once again exposes Pakistan. I mean, we just heard from the Air Force in Taiwan, and now all this information that has been put out. This is very crucial information. What are you hearing from the government? Has the Indian Air Force already formally given all this information to them? Will the government be looking into it? Will they be making a statement? Can we expect to hear from the government amid all the demands for evidence and proof from the opposition? Because that's what they've been asking. That's what they have been putting pressure on the government for.
Well, the way Pakistan has been spreading false news, it might be an option for the government to come out with the evidence as has been provided by the Air Force in their assessment. In fact, the Air Force, as far as giving out information, has already changed their strategy. Yesterday, for the first time in an official statement, the Air Force stated that Pakistani claims that Su-30 of the Indian Air Force was shot down are false, and that this was their way of covering up for the F-16 that was brought down by the Indian Air Force, and also perhaps one pilot who was a victim of the airstrike done by the MiG-21s on 27th last month. So Air Force finally yesterday did say that Pakistan is using propaganda, and no Su-30, in fact, of the Indian Air Force was brought down. So at some point of time, the government will definitely have the opportunity and the option to give this evidence that they have through the Air Force's assessment and put it in public domain.
So the satellite imagery and all the information confirming that Balakot airstrikes successfully hit their targets. Shiv, when you were going through all the information accessed by you, what is the one thing that really stood out, and how important will all this information be to nail Pakistan's lies? Because they've been, coming out with all sorts of propaganda, all sorts of narrative, which of course is to soothe their country, the domestic audience. But, this satellite imagery is is concrete evidence and proof that this was a target well achieved by the Indian Air Force.
You know, the Indian Air Force is of the view, and I'm speaking unofficially, of course, nobody's on the record, that many journalists around the world use a selective understanding of the effect of weapons when it really suits certain agendas. Now, we're not going to cast aspersions on Reuters or any other media because we are India Today, we're independent. What I am saying that the Indian Air Force says similar weapons used by the United States on reinforced structures in Syria or elsewhere have had similar apparent lack of damage on the surface, because there is a real understanding. People know that penetration warheads don't cause damage on the surface. They go right through the surface and create damage on the inside, because the purpose is not to bring down the building, but to try and kill everyone inside that building, because you've got intelligence that there may be terror recruitments or training happening inside that building. And I have a confirmation from the Air Force also, Avantika, that every single bomb launched on the night of the 26th was in fact a penetration warhead fitted Spice 2000 bomb. There was no other kind of bomb that was deployed by the Mirage 2000 fighters on that night. So every one of those bombs, there couldn't possibly be the sort of damage perhaps that people are expecting. I think people are expecting completely devastated, buildings, completely demolished, things smashed to smithereens. A penetration bomb with a penetration warhead would not cause that kind of apparent damage, and the apparent damage would be in the form of penetration holes about 40 to 70 centimeters wide, and those are fully apparent apparently in the satellite imagery as well.
And is
as
that the evidence that the opposition is seeking from the government? Are they seeking proof of the damage that was caused near the facility, the training center? Is that what they want to see? I mean, there's a lot of noise about the proof around these airstrikes. I want you to elaborate on these portions, these images that you've seen through these satellite maps. Do you see that damage around the Balakot or the training center?
Look, I'll tell you, Avantika, I have looked at images, okay? I've looked at images of the effects of a penetration strike in Syria by comparable weapons deployed by Israel or the United States,
right,
on tests or in Syria,
right,
and the apparent external damage looks pretty similar to what the Air Force's own dossier and imagery has made possible in Balakot, which means no massive destruction of the building, but a penetration missile that's gone deep into that building and possibly killed people inside it. Now, the Air Force is not getting into the opposition politics, obviously. They are not going to step into the political sphere and try and oppose what the Congress has said. That's not their job. That is entirely up to the Modi government, whether it wants to. What we are reporting here on India Today is that there is a fresh understanding of the weapons used, which we are reporting for the first time, and that evidence, such as it is, in terms of 12 pages of satellite imagery and an unspecified number of pages of synthetic aperture radar from an Indian intelligence aircraft flying in Indian airspace, have been submitted now officially by the Air Force to the government. So now, whatever decision the government takes, politically speaking, whether to show it to the left and the Congress, or send a copy of it to Reuters or whoever else, that is entirely up to the government. We are simply reporting here that the Indian Air Force is convinced of the proof it has. It says that there is comparable proof of the performance of similar weapons in other operations, and therefore they see there is a selective application of knowledge about the analysis of these weapons by journalists in other countries, and therefore they want to correct that view.
Absolutely. Sushant Sareen is also joining us. Sushant, getting in information from the Air Force that they've put together all the information, all the evidence. One thing that clearly has been established is that the targets were successfully hit. These were precision attacks, thereby debunking, Pakistan's narrative that the missiles missed their target. And it's interesting, Pakistan has not even allowed anyone access to the facility that was successfully targeted by the Indian Air Force.
Well, this entire debate is a kind of a red herring. It is not a serious debate to my mind. I think the real import of the airstrikes was the strategic impact it has had on the situation. And some of that impact we are seeing in terms of the kind of actions which Pakistan is now being forced to take against some of these terror groups, and the kind of international pressure which has started coming on Pakistan. Having said that, I think if the Air Force has some evidence, I don't see how anybody can produce images or photographs of bodies which probably have been charred beyond recognition, probably incinerated in these kind of strikes. I don't see how anybody can get any kind of, iron cast evidence of what exactly happened once the bombs penetrated. The fact that the Pakistanis, after doing all the grandstanding of taking delegations of journalists to the particular site, and have not done it, despite the fact that the weather is no longer bad, as initially it was being claimed as an excuse by the Pakistanis, I think in itself tells you a lot of things. Thirdly, the Pakistanis claim that this was just a madrasa. Now, if it was a madrasa and it continues to be a madrasa, then why have students been pulled out of that place? Why haven't you taken people out there? Now, after 10 days of a strike, if you're going to start taking people, what is the surety that you haven't entirely cleaned up the place? But again, I come back to the main thing. The fact that the Indian Air Force, and under the instructions of the government, decided to launch such a daring attack across not just the line of control but into Pakistan, I think was the real import of that strike. Whether one terrorist died or 300 died is immaterial.
Absolutely.
I think the impact of that strike is in the messaging which was delivered and which has got the Pakistanis all panicky and jumpy and wondering what India will do next. So that is what we should be focusing on. The rest is a political debate in which I have very little interest.
Right. Gaurav Sawant, the executive editor, is also joining us on the broadcast. Gaurav, 12 pages of high-resolution satellite imagery submitted by the Indian Air Force to the government. Will the government be using this once again to expose Pakistan? Because the standard line of defense has been that we don't have proof, there isn't enough evidence, despite, we've submitting several dossiers, testimonies, transcripts, etc. That's their standard line. They always wish to play the victim card.
So as far as Pakistan is concerned, Pakistan knows the truth. Pakistan knows it has been hit. The fact that there were eyewitness accounts in Pakistan that spoke of ambulances going there, taking people out, retrieving them, all of that is known. That's point one. Point two, the fact that Pakistan took journalists there after some days and not exactly to the madrasa, but places around it, also goes on to show that Pakistan is covering up. Then there were some reports that seem to indicate that some rooftops were repaired, some sheds were repaired before fresh satellite images were taken multiple days later.
Right.
As far as Indian Air Force is concerned, Avantika, IAF is very clear. Shiv has spoken to top sources, so have I. IAF is very clear. They got a target, they hit the target, they've had the desired results, and that they can do it again. They're only explaining what kind of weapons were used and why the damage is not the way perhaps some expected to see in post-World War II aerial bombings. This is 21st century. This is precision-guided munition being used. So the impact is very different from perhaps cluster bombs being used earlier.
Interesting. Gaurav Sawant, Shivrur, who got us all the information, and Abhishek Balla with us on the broadcast. Anula Singh from the BJP is also joining us. Ma'am, thanks so much for speaking to us. Such important evidence that has been put together by the Indian Air Force, the dossier that has been submitted to the government, that once again proves how successful the precision strikes were at the training facility. How will the government use this information? What are you hearing from the government?
See, I'm not the right person to comment on it. If you want to hear the aspect of the government, then you need to talk to the spokesperson of the Defense Ministry. But this is an answer to the opposition who was trying to penalize, I will say, defense forces of our country. Now, today the proofs have been given by the defense force as well. So now what they have to say. But for the technicalities, definitely the spokesperson of the Defense Ministry will be there, and I can only say that the amount of appreciation we all have for our forces is uncountable, and opposition should think before they comment on the villainous of our forces.
Absolutely. Shiv, this kind of information that has been put together by the Indian Air Force also validates India's claims regarding the effect of the strikes, which only strengthens India's case globally, isn't it? India has already launched a very coordinated and meticulous effort to get all of the global countries together and mount maximum pressure on Pakistan. But this is information that goes on to vindicate India's stand globally.
When technology comes into play, and the Indian Air Force is a professional service, it's not a political party. They don't have the they don't have the option of brushing things under the carpet, because there are satellites, there are US satellites, there are commercial satellites, there's all kinds of imagery available to confirm or debunk what the Indian Air Force may be claiming. So that is one side. So it's a professional service. Let's be absolutely sure about that. The Indian Air Force is saying very specific things here, and let's get one other aspect out of the way, which Gaurav and I have been reporting, is that not a single country, Avantika, apart from Pakistan, not a single country, no matter where it is in the world, has questioned India's intent in conducting these airstrikes. Nobody has said, why did India do it, or India has been wrong in doing this.
Yes,
so the moral authority that India enjoys in conducting the Balakot strikes is unquestioned, except by, of course, the victim nation, which is Pakistan. This is historic. We conducted these strikes on Pakistani territory, not just in POK. That's one side of it. The second side is India has no diplomatic issues here. The world is on India's side as far as the Balakot strikes is concerned. That is not the challenge here. The challenge here is a misinformation and propaganda campaign that the Indian Air Force sees as people trying to debunk the idea that the targets were not hit, to try and somehow suggest that the Indian Air Force has failed in its mission. Now, the Indian Air Force, knowing that the world is watching, knowing that there are other sensors that are recording what's going on, has submitted a certain amount of proof, and this is what our sources are telling us, straight to the government, and said, here's the evidence, and in simple, if you need to submit proof to anyone, this is the professional proof that we have.
Right.
Cloud cover was there, etc. But we know that satellite imagery has been taken a little later. Like Gaurav was pointing out, it's been a full week now since the operation took place. Days later, repair work has begun in many of those places. But even given all of that, and even assuming all of that, a penetration device, and this bears repeating because this is really the crux of the matter now, a penetration warhead fitted on a Spice 2000 bomb would not cause the kind of external damage that most people are perhaps expecting. People are expecting perhaps like an inferno-like situation where you have blast debris scattered in every place, and the remnants of a demolished structure. That would not be the case when a penetration fuse takes place.
But you have images of multiple little craters that I assume would be created when a strike happens.
My sources tell me, Avantika, that the satellite imagery, which I have not personally seen, I have seen other images, but my sources in the Air Force tell me that that the satellite imagery, first of all, is of a very high quality, and it's of a high resolution. It's of a classified resolution. Has been submitted to the government. There could be sensitivities over revealing the kind of resolution that we actually have. But those satellite images, I am told, confirm the penetration structures on those buildings. You can actually see them very neatly, I am told. That's what my sources within the government and the Air Force actually say. So that part, the Air Force is not worried about that at all, because for them, they don't need to worry. I mean, their targets are not about satisfying the Congress or satisfying Reuters or satisfying anybody else.
Absolutely.
They were given a task based on a political decision. They conducted that task, and the end game, the bottom line for them is 80% of our weapons have hit their targets, and this is how those weapons actually worked. Simple as that.
Absolutely. In fact, the Indian Air Force Chief, Air Chief Marshal B.S. Dhanwar, even confirmed the precision strikes on the terror launch pad in Pakistan's Balakot. Let's listen in.
Target has been clearly amplified by the Foreign Secretary in his statement.
Yeah.
And of course, if he planned to hit the target, we hit the target. Otherwise, why would he have responded?
ANI, please.
If he had dropped bombs in the jungle, there's no need for him to respond.
Okay, we have with us, I want to bring in Air Marshal Anil Chopra, fighter pilot, Mirage veteran, and a well-known analyst. Air Marshal Chopra, good afternoon. fresh details coming out about the proof. You know, there's been so much demand for proof of, you know, how accurate the strikes were, what damage was done. You know, we've accessed details through our sources, Air Marshal Chopra, of, you know, penetration warheads being used in these particular strikes. So a penetration warhead was used on the Spice 2000 bombs. Take us through your professional assessment. Isn't it true that the use of such weapons would not cause the kind of external damage or apparent damage that people are perhaps expecting, and that's where all this doubt has come from?
You know, Shiv, it is unfortunate that some people in the country, including some media people, are continuing to ask for proof when the Air Chief has already said that there is ongoing operations and we can say this much and no more. And yet, Air Force is being forced to reveal some of the you know, things related to the damage. Now, I have been speaking all those people, including you and some other people, who know what this weapon Spice 2000 is all about, will fully understand as to how it operates. When fitted on the aircraft, it's like a missile. It's got folded wings. Moment it is released, the wings open out, and now it becomes a glide bomb. Depending on height and speed, it will cover a distance of 50 to 100 kilometers. It depends on these two factors. And short of the target, it pops up and then takes a steep dive, then penetrates, goes into the ground, and thereafter, because of a delay fuse, it then explodes. Now, something which is going to explode under the ground after. So if it is a building, which is, we know that this whole complex is a building complex. We all have seen the satellite pictures. It will penetrate the roof, then penetrate the ground underneath it, and then explode. And when it explodes, it will have an upheaval effect at the bottom. So the roof, which could be 10 to 15 meters high, we do not know. After all, it's an assembly area. 300 people are supposed to be under training over there. So you may, in satellite picture, see very little, but the actual damage would have taken place. But notwithstanding that, high-resolution satellite pictures, we know that any responsible Air Force will have a system of battle damage. High-resolution satellite pictures are now apparently available with the Air Force, and they have given it to the people up the chain in the government on as-required basis. So I think once the Air Force says that this is it, and I think there should be no doubt in anybody's mind in the country. And how many number of people were there? We know NTRO has said that how many signals they were picking up. So they are talking about around 300 people were in the complex under training. How many of them have died? All that the Air Chief has said. It is something which will be evolving, and I'm sure the government will have some more information through other sources on the ground in that country.
Right, sir. Absolutely. For the benefit of our viewers who have just tuned in, a quick recap. We have all this information that have been put out exclusively by India Today. In fact, Air Force sources telling India Today that they have presented some hard proof, some very important evidence on the Balakot strikes to the government. We also have information of how this very detailed document, it's a 12-page document which has already given a lot of high-resolution satellite imagery that all has been handed over to the government. Abhishek, what are you hearing now from the government? Because a dossier has already been sent in to other countries as well from the Indian government about these airstrikes on the terror training camps on Balakot. What are you hearing from the government on this additional information that has been handed over by the Indian Air Force to them?
Well, as part of procedure, the Indian Air Force has given whatever details they have had about this airstrike. They carried out their assessment, they scrutinized all the imagery that they had through satellites available and also through synthetic aperture radars, and this has been handed over to the government. Now it's up to the government whether the government wants to put it out in public domain or not, but as far as the Air Force is concerned, even the Air Chief Marshal B.S. Dhanua a few days ago made it very clear that as far as making an assessment on casualties is concerned, that's not the job of the Air Force. The Air Force was given a task, they locked onto their targets and they hit their targets. Now we know, as Shiv has accessed this dossier, which says that 80% of the targets were hit. So these are the facts as of now on the table in front of the government. Politics over it can continue, but as far as the Air Force is concerned, the chief himself led the way in saying that there should be no politics over it. That's the big hint that he had given. He did not answer either the opposition or the government. He only put on the table the plain facts that the Indian Air Force had. And now, with this report given to the government, it's up to the government to either make it public or keep it classified.
Absolutely, and Gaurav, that's exactly what the forces are supposed to do. They execute their orders given to them. They successfully targeted and destroyed a Jaish-e-Mohammed camp in Balakot in Pakistan. Then where does the doubts arise? Why the questions around casualty figures and the politics around the same?
Avantika, we are in election season and the opposition seriously thinks that the Narendra Modi government has succeeded in changing the narrative to national security, and that is where the opposition to an extent thinks it's on the back foot. So they're challenging the government on casualty figures. The government's point is whether 2 terrorists were killed or 200, 3 or 300, that's not material. What is material is the fact that there's been a paradigm shift in the manner in which India went and punished Pakistan's state-sponsored terror, not just in Pakistan-occupied Kashmir, but beyond in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, targeting one of the biggest terrorist training camps. And according to, well, ministers in the government, yesterday you had Minister of State for External Affairs, General V.K. Singh, say that the assessment was that there were some 300 terrorists there when these Spice 2000 bombs struck. So did those 300 of them, did all the 300 survive, perish? We still do not know. But according to government sources, again, Avantika, it takes time for ground intelligence and ground assessment. So if there were about, let's say, 300 mobile phones that were active there at that point of time, what is the NTRO's assessment? Post that, how many of those mobile phones remained active subsequently? Were these mobile phones being handled by an individual or multiple individuals, or multiple mobile phones being handled by one individual? All of that, there is still no clarity. But the fact that there were casualties is something that the government is very clear about.
Absolutely. And Shiv, can you just tell us a little bit more about these Israeli-made Spice 2000 precision-guided bombs? I mean, what is the specific use of it and the Indian Air Force's usage in their airstrikes on this training camp in Balakot?
The use of the Israeli Spice 2000 weapon was a very considered decision by the Indian Air Force, Avantika, because this is a standoff range weapon, which means that the aircraft didn't need to go very close to Balakot to actually conduct these strikes. They were able to deploy them from tens of kilometers away. These are weapons that have pretty good guidance systems. They are weatherproof. Not just electro-optical but also GPS guided. They have various redundancies. Most importantly, this is a modular weapon that can be fitted with different kinds of fuses and warheads, and all of the Spice 2000 weapons that were deployed for this mission all had penetration warheads, which basically means they're programmed to penetrate through certain structures. Once it hits a contact, the fuse is activated and then the explosion takes place after the penetration happens. So it goes through the tin roof and the reinforced concrete, perhaps through a couple of stories. That's also programmable, and then the explosion happens. So the damage is usually contained and internal. So even there are pictures of hangars, reinforced concrete fighter hangars in Syria, where the US has dropped these penetration bombs, where they go right through the hangar and destroy the aircraft parked inside, and the hangar is completely intact apart from that one little hole. So that's what these weapons are really designed for. Absolutely.
Majid Memon, leader with the NCP, is also joining us on the broadcast. Mr. Memon, thanks so much for speaking to us. Here is all the information. This is the information coming in from the Indian Air Force. They have prepared a very detailed dossier containing high-resolution radar images that validates India's claims and the Indian Air Force's claims about the effectiveness of the airstrikes. How do you respond?
You see, the problem is that unnecessary controversy was created by BJP leaders and BJP functionaries making irresponsible statements almost for the last 10 to 12 days that so many people have died without any authenticity, without any material, which should have been prevented. And it was because of that there was so much of noise all throughout. People of this country are entitled to know that if we have stuck our enemy and we have caused certain deaths there, then we must know the exact position, or we could have the ministers would have refrained from making any comment about the number of people killed. And that is why there was this controversy raised so high. Now that once the air chief made a statement that, well, we did strike the target, but we are unable to give the numbers of casualties, so that was enough. That's the end of the matter.
Mr. Memon, but does it make a difference whether 3 terrorists were killed or 300? Shouldn't India rejoice in the fact that India has punished Pakistan state-sponsored terror deep inside Pakistan, sir?
No. See, the problem is that whatever has happened, we have achieved. It is an achievement of the government. We are all proud of our Air Force. We are proud of our Sena. But all these things, it was unnecessarily brought into controversy only because false statements and claims were made by irresponsible ministers throughout. Somebody saying 400 killed, somebody 350 said, some 300, some said 200. Why the hell should they open their mouth and make irresponsible statement in such a sensitive matter concerning the security and integrity of this country? Please ask, why don't you ask BJP people that what was the basis of their making all such kinds of evaluations when they had no material? Don't try to mislead people and don't try to make false comments like this.
All right, Mr. Memon, thank you so much for joining us. We leave it at that. And amid much political furor and the opposition demanding for proof and evidence of the Indian Air Force's airstrikes in Balakot, sources in the Air Force have told India Today that they have presented all that proof and evidence of the Balakot strikes, all that information that has been handed over to the government. India Today, in fact, accessing the first details of the Indian Air Force's dossier that clearly refutes the missiles missed narrative that is being propagated by Pakistan. India Today's consulting editor Shiv Arur, who's got us all this information, is joining us. I also have with me executive editor Gaurav Sawant. Shiv, big news, and this is important information that once again goes on to validate Indian Air Force's claims of those effective airstrikes and also debunking Pakistan's narrative about how this was a bogus airstrike, this was a bogus mission.
You know, Avantika, in the midst of this non-stop fog of war where there is so much misinformation coming in from all sides and not just from Pakistan, you know, we have to use our professional assessment based on what we get from our sources to put together as accurate a picture as we possibly can. Now, I am in touch with my sources within the military, including the Air Force, and we have it on good authority that the Air Force has submitted a dossier of visual information to the government, which contains 12 pages of high-resolution satellite imagery, synthetic aperture radar imagery captured by an Indian intelligence gathering aircraft that was flying in Indian airspace on that particular day and the day after, which to the Air Force's professional assessment fully is commensurate with the weapons deployed. These weapons were Spice 2000 precision-guided bombs containing penetration warheads, which means that the damage, the apparent external damage would not have been high because the entire purpose of these weapons is to penetrate through reinforced structures, go down a couple of stories into the internal part of it and then explode, causing damage inside. So the purpose of these weapons, you know, terrible as it sounds, is to kill the people inside, the terrorists who are training inside those facilities, and not necessarily to actually break or demolish the structure. So this evidence has been provided by the Indian Air Force to the government, along with a lot of other you know, details which we of course cannot report here on India Today. So that data in the form of that visual dossier, it's not the Air Force's opinion, this is visual data from a satellite and synthetic aperture radar, is now with the government, and we are reporting the complexion of that data. Satellite imagery, synthetic aperture radar imagery, and the Air Force's professional assessment that says, you gave us a job to do, we've done the job, and our assessment is that 80% of our weapons have struck. Now, if anybody is wondering why it's only 80% and not 100%, when precision strikes of this kind take place, there is always a redundancy that is allowed, a margin, because you want to make sure that all your targets are hit and you can deploy a couple more weapons, perhaps in the event that one of them doesn't hit, the other certainly will. But the overall intention was no collateral damage. This was a lonely place on a hilltop, but to get inside that building and cause all the damage.
And India has already launched a coordinated move to mount global pressure on Islamabad. That pressure already telling on Pakistan. India already submitting all the proof to the United States about the usage of the F-16, and now the Indian Air Force getting in those high-resolution satellite imagery, putting in all the information and evidence together and presenting it to the Indian government. I'm going to take a short break. I'm going to request all of my colleagues and guests to kindly stay on. We're going to continue with our coverage on the other side with my colleague Chaiti. Stay tuned.
Thanks for watching the video. For more such news and updates, please like, share and subscribe to India Today. Also check out our other great videos from our channel. We know you would love to.